Audio made possible by www.jackettome.com. Audio Fanfiction Productions presents Wide Awake. Fanfiction written by Angskata003. Fanfiction inspired by the Twilight Saga written by Stephanie Meyer. Chapter 48. Monumental Macaroons.
Edward's point of view. It took me 33 hours of continual driving to reach the Forks city limit. I didn't sleep or eat, and I only stopped to get gas when it was absolutely necessary. I probably violated every speed restriction in the process, but I couldn't be bothered by such trivialities. The drive was unlike the one to Chicago I'd made 4 months earlier. Then, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I'd been running away from something, from Bella, and what we'd done to one another, from Carlisle, from Alice and me, when they'd found out from every last one of my fuck-ups. But on this drive, I was running towards something and leaving something else behind. With every mile I put between my mother and me, I felt the portion of my soul devoted to her screaming in protest. In return, the part of my soul that needed mending, the part reserved for Bella, Carlisle, and everyone else, that part of my soul buzzed with impatience to rush to Forks. The two conflicting sensations were warring with my every emotion, and I found it impossible to be either eager or grief-stricken for more than a minute at any given time. It was a lot like being pushed toward the west while being pulled toward the east. If I hadn't already made up my mind, I might have turned around. When I finally arrived in Forks, I was a fucking mess of nerves. My mind had been so on track during the drive that I hadn't even stopped to consider the time of day in which I'd be arriving. It was only 8 in the morning, which meant that everyone would be at either work or school. As I approached the familiar road that led to the White Mansion, like home, I began scrutinizing every fern and domestic flora of the neighborhood for changes. There really wasn't much to take note of except that the trees now had leaves and needles. When I left, everything had been bare and just scarcely sprouting for the spring. Now it was lush, and even though the impending autumn was already beginning to take the leaves, it appeared lively and verdant. I was getting sentimental over motherfucking foliage. A self-depreciating smile tugged at my lips as I rounded the last corner and brought the house into view. But my eyes never had the opportunity to fully scrutinize it, because when I saw the Brandon's front lawn, my foot slammed on the brake and screeched the Volvo to a sudden halt in the middle of the gravelly road. I was overcome with terror that I was too late, and shit. It was only just beginning to hit me as I gripped my steering wheel and gazed at the large for sale sign on Bella's lawn that it was entirely fucking possible that I'd never be able to get her back. It was the first time I'd ever allowed myself to really consider what I'd done to her. From Bella's perspective, I'd run away. Could she think that? Would she be wrong? The remembrance of that final day and what I had done hit me with a crushing blow of horror. I hadn't had the time in Chicago to consider it all fully because I was so occupied with my mother, but now it seemed like the most significant thing ever. Not only did I leave, and not only had she completely understood and had been supportive of my choice, but I'd broken the promise to return and had never even really kept in touch. I couldn't even bring myself to conceive the possibilities of how she likely felt about me now, of how she likely believed I felt about her. Christ, I'd really made a clusterfuck of everything. Just as I was beginning to indulge myself in a really fucking horrendous meltdown full of self-loathing and regret, movement from the house next door caught my eye. I shifted my gaze to see a blonde head emerging from the door as Carlisle reached down to retrieve a newspaper. He didn't even glance up as he stepped back inside and closed the door. I was reminded that Carlisle could probably tell me where Esme and the girls had gone. It wasn't over yet. I'd track my mother across the country. I could easily do the same for Bella. First, I had to get my shit together and face him, so I started toward the house and eased into the driveway. And then, I was nervous as shit once again. I rolled my eyes as I actually checked my hair in the rearview mirror. My hair really should have been my last concern, because my eyes were darkened from lack of sleep, and still had the red and swollen remnants of my tearful goodbye and the agonized moments following. I spent a moment smoothing out my hair and the wrinkles from my clothing before I decided that it was a lost cause, and exited the car. The air smelled of wet and green and cool and life, and just home. I was getting sentimental over motherfucking air. I huffed in annoyance with myself and began approaching the house. It was a different anxiety, and the kind I'd felt when I'd found my mother. This was impatience, not fear. I bounded up the steps, taking in the well-kept appearance with a subdued grin as I reached the door, and paused in abrupt uncertainty. I knocked, because even though it was home to me, I had no way of knowing if I'd be welcomed or wanted. With every second that passed, my heart raced with the possibilities that I would and then my impatience turned fearful. I wondered, if neither Bella nor Carlisle wanted me, would I go back to Chicago? I shook my head in objection to the fleeting thought. I'd stick around and keep trying, because they were worth it. But I was growing fretful. Really fucking fretful. I shifted my feet and tried to find something to do with my hands which hung limply at my sides. I was lightheaded with anxiety until the door finally opened. Carlisle kind of blinked at me as I stood in the doorway, and shoved my fists deep into my pockets to occupy them. He looked exactly the same, right down to the part of his hair, and the crease of his slacks. As the silence grew on, my really fucking fretful anxiety swelled, and I struggled to find something intelligent to say. Those are always the moments in which I decide to say the most retarded fucking thing possible, so I wasn't at all surprised by what emerged from my mouth. "Sup?" I asked, feigning coolness, and internally kicking myself in the head as I gazed at his blank stare. Carlisle seemed to be shaken from his astonishment at the sound of my dense greeting. "Sup?" he seemed to mock, his lips twitching into a sad smile. I was grateful at least for the change of atmosphere as I grimaced. "I was afraid you'd be working," I mumbled while diverting my gaze behind his shoulder into the foyer.
"I have a late shift,"
he whispered absently, answering my silent question as I fought to remain comfortable under his calculating gaze. I nodded with a light hum and shifted my gaze to the toes of my boots. I nudged a dampened red leaf and balled my fists tightly in my pockets. He gasped, almost inaudibly, and stepped back.
"I'm sorry, come in please,"
he offered in a panicked voice, and I breathed a sigh of relief as I extracted my clenched fists from my pockets and stepped forward. The foyer was exactly as I remembered, and he walked ahead, leading me to the living room, occasionally peeking at me over his shoulder. When I entered, I was taken aback by the changes in the large room. The furniture had been rearranged, which was the most obvious change, but there were also new drapes and decorations scattered around. It looked nice and comfortable. The new arrangement of furniture made sense in comparison to the space. It was more colorful and vibrant. He turned to me with a tight smile, and gestured for me to sit on the sofa, so I sunk into it, sighing in contentment. As the soft and plush upholstery cradled me, I suppressed a frown as I observed the room. It was probably the most notable evidence of how much time had passed. I didn't really like that. He sat directly across from me in a large armchair, and propped his ankle on his knee.
"How are you?"
he asked casually, but his watchful stare betrayed his caution. "Okay," I shrugged, still allowing my eyes to wander the room. "You?" I asked, really fucking hating the seashell walk we were doing. I wondered how ridiculous it would be to yank a grown man from a beige armchair and just hug the living shit out of him. Probably pretty fucking ridiculous, I decided. "Good," he nodded, shifting his gaze to his lap, and reaching up to scratch his eyebrow. I hummed in response, watching as his lips returned to that same forced smile.
"How long are you in town for?"
he asked, finally meeting my gaze, before adding, "Where are you staying?" My heart sank into my stomach as I realized that he assumed I was just passing through. "What makes you think I'm not staying here?" I asked with a certain double connotation that I wasn't certain he'd catch. He raised his eyebrows, the brief spark of hope in his eyes immediately extinguished.
"You knocked,"
he explained in a controlled voice. I huffed, and raked my fingers through my hair. I didn't know if I'd be welcomed, I defended, and instantly struggled to rein in my annoyance. He sighed, an oddly sad sound, and rubbed his forehead back and forth.
"This has always been your home too, Edward,"
he muttered, but appeared frustrated before visibly composing himself and meeting my gaze.
"What do you need?"
he asked. I furrowed my brows in confusion, so he explained with a blank expression.
Money, documents, clothing.
What? I asked while shaking my head, but he was already reaching into his back pocket to extract his wallet. Jesus, Carlisle, I don't want money, I insisted in mortification. He seriously thought I'd come back here just to bleed him dry a little more? It was appalling. He met my gaze and sighed once again in frustration, as he dropped his wallet. I was hurt and tired and disappointed as I stood. Couldn't it be possible that I just wanted to come home? I asked dreadfully as my eyes likely filled and brimmed with the pain of his humiliating assumption. I really didn't want to leave, but his insinuation was offensive and degrading. Maybe I should have gone with the hug, after all. His blue eyes squinted for a moment, regarding my wound expression carefully before his face and posture crumbled.
I'm sorry.
He sighed remorsefully, and looked away in shame.
I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. I suppose it's just been.
He paused with an exhale before meeting my gaze, and shaking his head.
I meant ass,
he said simply. I released my tense fists and eased back down to the sofa, his eyes following mine fluidly. That makes two of us, I whispered, and wondered while he shrugged if he'd caught my silent apology. Must be a Cullen thing, I muttered under my breath, and raked my fingers through my disgusting hair. Showering was definitely a high priority, and I pondered the comfort of my large bathroom as I met his gaze, his expression cutting me off mid-sigh. What? His brows were deeply furrowed, as he gazed at me in silence for many moments. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained with some unfathomable emotion.
Do you even consider yourself a Cullen?
He asked while visibly attempting to control his expressive reaction. My heart sank a little more as I looked away. I tried to consider everything I'd likely put him through over the last 5 years, to make that one little question so enormous to him. It was really unforgivable. I'd done awful things, and my behavior had been monstrous more often than not. I couldn't imagine ever just letting all that shit go, and accepting any apology I might offer. Apologies were shit. Apologies were words laced with sincerity, that felt empty regardless. Actions spoke louder, and words, and I could speak louder than anything if you pissed me off hard enough. I met his gaze, Carlisle nearly flinching from my angry stare, but I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at myself for never accepting his sincerity, and making him so goddamn submissive to all of my asinine antics. As I recalled the feeling of utter misery I'd felt when my mother pushed me away, I decided I couldn't let him feel that anymore. My mother's a drunk, I confessed quietly, and his brows creased further. I leaned forward with a sigh, resting my elbows on my knees, and began in a weary voice. The night of the fire was their anniversary. It was everything Carlisle had ever wanted, and more. I could now explain the full story from my side, and hers, as well, even though I was tired of talking about it and tired of living it and ready to move on. He was visibly taken aback as I abruptly plunged into my recollection of the fire, and everything that happened following. His eyes, captivated and compassionate, never left mine as I spoke. I could almost see him absorbing my words, like they were the most important thing to him ever. He never stopped to ask questions, and I tried my best to make certain he'd have none. Everything, up until the day I'd been admitted into the hospital, was explained in full detail, and his concentration didn't waver when I began recollecting the entirety of my stay in Chicago. His eyes grew wide and horrified as I explained the full gravity of my mother's condition, and I looked away in embarrassment as I told him of the townhouse and the way we had lived. When I told him of how I had to care for my mother, cleaning up her vomit, and ensuring the simplicity of her hygiene, I felt vulnerable and ashamed. Deciding I couldn't possibly feel any more humiliated, I even told him of my father's gravesite, and the copious amounts of flowers I'd left. It was a little soon to just start fucking telling him everything. Admittedly, I just walked through the door, and dumped it on him like a bucket of cold water. But I didn't have much of anything to offer anyone, Carlisle most of all. I'd finally understood Carlisle's soul, after caring for my mother for so long, and now he knew mine. I think we were probably both exhausted after my mouth finally stopped moving. I relaxed my head against the soft back of the sofa, and relished in the comfort of Carlisle's home. It wasn't just the expensive luxury